Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. A very warm welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar on project benchmarking, and in particular, what can the construction industry learn from the Covid-19 vaccine development program? Today's webinar is in partnership with Linesight, a global construction consultancy. My name is Alan Muse, Global Head of Building and Construction Standards at the RICS, and today we're discussing some of the lessons learned from Big Pharma and the role of benchmarking and data sharing in improving performance in construction. Over the next hour, we'll be looking at how the rollout of vaccines was achieved so quickly, how collaborative and cultural barriers were overcome to share valuable data, and what the transferable lessons are for the construction industry. We have a very knowledgeable panel with us today to discuss these issues, and therefore, may I please introduce them to you. Firstly, Nigel Barnes, Head of Life Sciences at Linesight. Hello, Nigel.
Hello, Alan. Hello, everybody.
And also Steve Townsend, Project Controls Director and in the Global Capital Projects Group at GSK. Hello, Steve.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Alan.
Now, we always welcome your active involvement, so please do submit questions to our panel, as it really helps to bring the conversation to life. If you are new to these webinars, you should see that you can submit questions at any time using the question box on your screen. We will pick up as many as we can as we go through the session. But turning firstly to Steve, and Big Pharma and this collaboration in terms of speed of delivery. Steve, how was Big Pharma able to develop COVID-19 vaccines so quickly?
Okay. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and from my perspective, I'm an engineer by profession, not a scientist, but I'm quite happy to give some basic understanding of why things happen so quickly. And you might not be surprised the fact that this didn't happen overnight. This development, the scientific development, had been going on for many years, and in particular with the platform, the solution platform is the mRNA platform, which helps bringing all this together. One of the other aspects of this was data. Okay, so how do we actually record and report data? And the overriding theme through all of this is collaboration. So, for example of that, there's a want and a willingness for this to happen, to solutions to be provided. For example, it can take months to get volunteer groups together. This practically happened overnight. As you can imagine, there are quite a number of specified testing regimes which go into new developments of pharmaceutical products, and there has been a means of actually overlapping some of those because of the surety of what's going on here. And finally, about the surety of delivery. Sometimes investments in new products requires risk monies, and as everyone is aware, during the early stages of the pandemic, the monies and support was provided not just from government but also from private finances as well to get these solutions in place. But I think the two overriding things which come out of the reasons for this acceleration is collaboration and data. Okay, so it's about how you collect data and what you do with the data. Technology has really come to the forefront on that as well. Okay.
Thank you, Steve. That's fascinating, and I think we'll come back to this issue of collaboration and the culture needed to engender that later. But I also wanted to identify with what you've said in terms of the fact that it was a project, and projects need to bring people together quickly, sometimes who haven't worked with each other before, and that's so similar to the construction industry in many ways. I'm sure there are things we can learn as we go through this, and I'll pick up some of those points again. But turning now specifically, Nigel, to the role of benchmarking in this particular operation. I mean, what role do you think project benchmarking can play in bringing drugs to market faster and in fact in a more cost-effective way?
Yeah, it very much builds on the point that Steve made there about the facts and data. So the benchmarking is all about providing us collectively with the facts and data to support informed and quick decision making. So we're looking at very early on, is it the right cost and schedule? We talk about benchmarking of just being cost. We shouldn't forget that schedule is a key part of the data. So having that, it allows us to see how it compares to others, and then we can also set a baseline with that, with those facts and data of how much things should cost, how long they should take. And I think we all know once we've got a baseline, that's where you can improve from. So you're starting to give through that facts and data, the project teams and the stakeholders the right facts and data to allow them to make the right decisions and to give the right resources for people to deliver the projects. So that with that facts and data on the right, it can avoid delays through projects because we don't have to go back for refunding because we've got the right money at the first point of the project. And I think within through the collaboration that Steve also talked about, within the pharma industry especially, within the construction environment, it's not an area that the companies compete, and so they're quite readily happy to share data to look at how do we improve and in effect lower the cost. And we've also that moral obligation to do things as quick as possible. So it's around that sharing the data, benchmark, get the right cost in the first place to allow the projects to move. And what we're already seeing with this data is use the benchmark at the front end. We're actually seeing better outturn costs and more predictability on those outturn costs, which is what a lot of the shareholders and stakeholders are asking for. So we can do that with the data.
That's really interesting, Nigel. Thank you. Just a slight follow-up to that. I mean, did you feel, in terms of your consultancy, that you had senior management support from the client for this role? Because sometimes that's difficult to get that trust in terms of using benchmarking. So, did you find that was important and, in fact, obtainable on these projects?
Yes, Alan, very, very important to get it right, the right information. One of the things that we, of course, had to stress with collating the data is the confidentiality, so that we're working in a confidential way with the data, so we're not giving away any product or any market intelligence data related to the products. But it is actually usually the senior stakeholders that are looking for this information. So when people are going for approval of projects, for example, up to the main boards, ask the question, how does this compare to my competitors? What we've been able to say is, well, if you need to know how to compare it competitors, to allow that, you've got to share your own data in a bit of a TAT type arrangement, and that's working really well. And that's and involvement from the senior stakeholders has allowed us to move forward.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Nigel, because I think even from GSK, and you'd expect that from our organisation, that it has a large capital programme. But actually, if you look across that and look at the different type of facilities that we're making or constructing throughout the world, that is in some respects, is a limited amount of information, a limited amount of data. And actually, the only way to actually really compare like facilities or the construction of like facilities is actually going and having those the benchmarking reviews and data input with a central organisation that then can actually facilitate that with our peers. So from peer pharmaceutical manufacturers as well, but we definitely don't hold enough then to give us an informed decision that we would like. So that's another important factor of why we do benchmarking in the first place.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel and Steve. That's an interesting point about the international context as well, Steve, and in terms of benchmarking, and perhaps I'll return to that later on because we're going to talk about standards, I think. But I wanted to turn to the fact that the pharma industry is competitive, like the construction industry in general, and sometimes there are challenges and barriers to sharing data in a competitive industry, as we all know. So how was a competitive industry like Big Pharma persuaded to share data? Steve?
Yeah, I think it's in terms of efficiencies, and looking back at, we talk about benchmarking from a cost, and it has a predominance, but also from a schedule. And schedules are usually driven by specific requirements, and I think that's with COVID. That's a similar sort of thing. It was a time. It was the fastest time to market. Basically, those are sort of principles that still need to be used. But actually, what that meant is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Okay, and if organization A and B and C are all trying to reinvent the wheel for this particular type of product to tackle COVID, then it does become inefficient, and it doesn't take long to realize that within the industries in this particular case that we are trying to all do the same sort of thing. And wouldn't it be much better actually then if we could actually share that the basis information? And going back to it from a, Nigel mentioned a regard to the confidentiality and the anonymity of information, and that's it, and that's a key point of it, because benchmarking is not about sharing information in regard to the actual processes that are used and the particulars about the processes. So it is quite specific data, but it helps in the design and the construct and the commission of facilities as well. So I think that's sort of the main reasons. But again, it hinges around collaboration and trust, and building that, and that is a step forward. Having that sort of approaches takes a different mindset, but there is definitely a benefits of having that collaborative mindset going forward. And I think that was one of the drivers in terms of people getting together.
Oh, thank you, Steve. And Nigel, I wondered what your view about this was as well, because it's one thing sharing data, but what form of data exactly was shared, and what degree of data was shared? Because coming back to Steve's point about a common goal here, I can understand that, but I think the devil's in the detail to some degree, isn't it, in terms of sharing data?
Absolutely, but it's making sure that it's the data that's specific to the construction and the manufacturing and the data around that, rather than, as Steve said, rather than the processes. So we're looking very much at taking all of the data from the companies that are taking part in sharing data with us at the moment, and looking at what trends. So we've got data analysis people working on the information and data, and looking at trends. What's it telling us about ratios? What's it telling us about percentages? What's it telling us about costs per factor? So we might be looking at so traditionally we've probably talked about cost per square meter, but is that relevant in manufacturing and laboratory spaces? So we might be looking at costs per scientist or space, or cost per litre of bioreactor, and so we start to pull out from the data these trends. We can also look at the factors within those for regional, because obviously the pharmaceutical industry is a global industry, and we need to know how much it would cost to do something similar in different countries around the world. What are the factors? Quite often equipment might be the same manufacturer of the processing equipment, but then you've got to look at import duties, and local labour rates might be lower in some countries than others, but this labour might need to be imported. So we can start to look at all of those trends to allow that informed decision making, and it's looking at across this of what others are doing, what are the industries doing, and also bringing in factors from other industries as well to make sure that we are making informed decisions. And I think that's what persuaded people to take part, to get that greater data set from other companies, other regions, other industries, to allow that decision making on trends that we're starting to see coming through.
Yeah, and I think it's also just worth mentioning, what Nigel's saying about particular factors is that there is an abundance of data available from the facilities, but again, you probably get to a point where you can't see the wood for the trees with the particular data. So for some examples, then some of the measures that we look at now actually exclude some of the data. For example, the cost of land, which should be a part of a normal capital estimate, you would probably not consider that for benchmarking purposes because it does vary so much, and it's also varying about how the particular location. What meterage or square foot do you require for this particular facility? So what you also try and do is then take away some of that. Some of the data which actually can cloud the view on that and move away from getting the data that matters. Okay. So I mean that's an example is sort of land costs, enabling costs as well. So some of those, we'd look at that and consider or remove some of the enabling costs from some of the factors for benchmarking, because again it can vary quite considerably from site to site location and existing infrastructure, what's there, what's not there, what needs to be done. Is there any requirement for future capacity to be built into this particular facility you want benchmarking? So again, it's just trying to make sure also that it's not everything. You don't want to, it gives it's almost like layers of information and layers of accuracy and surety. So as you mature your process, you go further down those layers to understand and become more understanding of your data and what does that actually mean.
Greater learning from the data. Yes, I understand. That's good. Thank you. And there's been a lot of debate, certainly in the construction industry, more specifically about how data can be shared to a greater degree. And obviously, many clients are quite interested in that. But some participants perhaps are more reluctant because of non-disclosure agreements that they have to sign and the general confidentiality attached quite often to commercial data. So I wondered what role do you think more independent professional bodies like the RICS or indeed others may play in being an independent repository for such data in terms of data sharing? What are your views on that, Steve or Nigel?
From our perspective, it's absolutely critical because it is that level of anonymity, level of confidentiality, and the trusting in that in the benchmarking partner, who then will look after the interests of everybody who's involved in that as well. It's absolutely critical. And I think you touched before, Alan, about standardization, which we'll probably go on to as well, because that also plays a part of the benchmarking. But it would be very difficult if we went to, from our organisation to and speak to our peers about sharing data. I'm sure that there will be plenty of other discussions about that, about what does that mean as what sort of confidentiality agreements we need to put in place anyway, and that would, I don't know how long that would take, but it would certainly slow down the process that you were trying to accelerate. So the Institute and other organisations have a key role in facilitating that benchmarking for organisations like ourselves and our peers.
Yeah, and I think for us at the moment, running the activity we're doing, we see ourselves as custodians of the data. The data is still owned by the parent companies, the pharmaceutical companies, and we're custodians of their data to analyse, compare, pull out the trends that I talked about earlier, so that we can allow that greater data set that Steve talked about. So the actual completion of projects by each of the companies, although they're spending a reasonable amount of money, is not the number of projects completed per year is actually not that high by each company. But if you look across all of the companies, it starts to get up. You start to get enough information that starts to make the data statistically relevant, as long as you're looking at all of that. So acting as the professional bodies acting as custodians to look across that data, but obviously, as we said, and we will keep repeating, because it is one of the harms is the confidentiality, because of you know, the industrial environment and that we're operating in.
Yeah, thank you. Great. And you mentioned standardization, and I was going to move on to talk about the quality of data and which we've already discussed slightly. But I just wondered generally, Nigel, what were the challenges in obtaining quality data and the problems and obstacles that you overcame?
Yeah, when you set out, when we set out, it looked quite big to do, but it's starting to understand the project world and how projects are put together. So again, repeating that confidentiality is a key part, and we've got to make sure sharing information that doesn't give away any of the market and product sensitive data. So that becomes one of the challenges. But then I think we will all say that, and that's why we call them projects, because they're discrete activities. So no projects are like for like. But actually, if you break projects down into their component parts, you do start to get quite a lot of alignment. So there is a shell and core, and there is a foundation, and a utility building, and there is clean rooms, etc., etc. If you start to look at those component parts, pull out key elements, and as Steve said earlier, there's certain elements that will be unique to each project, so you may not be able to benchmark that just is a cost that you need to do a little bit more work on and maybe do an estimate on rather than use benchmark. But if you break it down into its component parts, and then what we've been working with all of the companies that are involved in recording the data in standard work breakdown structures, so following industry standards where we can, making sure we are all using similar work breakdown structures, so it makes it easier to compare across the projects. Now, again, that's easier said than done, because there are different countries, there are different standards, there are different way packages are bought, there are different contractual routes. So the other way is actually with the data analysts that we've got on board to work with the cost people in each of the companies and just do an audit trail across from their existing work breakdown structure into a standard one, so that we can start to compare like for like. Quality of making sure that things are recorded in a similar way and we are comparing like for like, but also recognizing that just to recognize that, you know, the odd part of it, we need to say, actually, that is unique and we can't benchmark that.
Yeah, and I think picking up what Nigel's saying in terms of, it's not just about the standardization purely for the purposes of benchmarking, but actually within any organization where you have a number of projects across a number of capital teams, it's really helpful and useful if everybody understands that there is a standard and they utilize that standard and go forward with that. And if you move from project to project within an organization, you know what the standard is in terms of bringing an estimate together or a schedule together, either by stages or phases, and that helps also efficiencies within the normal course of design and build. So yeah, it's something that we strive for.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Alan. Yeah. It's worth just remembering the data we're using is completed projects only. So you could say it's real data rather than estimates. And the front end, we're using outturn costs from projects. So it provides actual real cost to complete. And then, of course, you've got to take into consideration how the project was there some acceleration costs in there because it was a fast track, but those all become factors in when we're analysing the data and normalising and looking at the comparators within the trends.
Yeah, very, very interesting. In terms of the standards that you mentioned, were there any particular standards that you found particularly useful here?
I think from the work breakdown structure that is probably the most common within the pharmaceutical sector is actually comes out of the Construction Industry Institute in the US. So again, back to professional bodies and working with a professional body to help provide that commonality across. So they've obviously done some work to look at what is the best for the industry. That's probably the most commonly used. So that's the basis of what we use. So using standards that come from the professional bodies, it provides that common piece in there, that in the middle is all to work around.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we've been involved in a collaborative international construction measurement standard called ICMS, which may well have relevance to this, certainly in the construction sector more generally. So we can see the benefit of having international standards that cross markets, which, going back to your internationalization point, Steve, is very important. Not many standards do cross markets, do they?
No, they don't. And then I think it just brings in the factors that you might use for location factors as well. So building a facility in Europe may, from a benchmarking perspective, have a different factor applied to a project which is built in the States. So there's additional work in making sure those wider factors of normalization from the same project being built on two different continents also has to be taken into consideration. And again, that's really driven by the research, the development, the institutes, the organizations who facilitate the benchmarking are usually the ones who take that view and come up with those guidelines for that normalization of those location factors that might apply to the projects as well. And of course, then, if you look at that from a strategic perspective in the future, it may be part of the factor that an organization depends where they would like to build the next facility as well. So again, there are other attributes to benchmarking which can be used by other stakeholders as well.
Did you find, Nigel or Steve, that the should cost benchmarking result, that the whole design team bought into that in terms of the development of the project, and you were able to control the project within that overall cost on and time envelope? Did that work in the way that it's often intended to work? Or did you have particular issues in terms of control of that? Particularly since you were working to quite fast programs, weren't you?
Yeah, I think the collective industry across the delivery teams, I suppose, with the design, the construction management, the project controls team, are collectively bought into getting using the right information at the start of projects. So the benchmarking data to allow us to hold to what we believe as that collective team is the right number, and those not to be again, coming back to that, using facts and data to get the right number to give the project team the space to deliver with the right number. So yes, collectively, all of the groups involved are supportive of the benchmarking data because quite often the project could start with too low a number because it hasn't been factored correctly, benchmarked correctly, and then all parties are on the back foot from the get-go. So I think that the benchmarking has got not just across for us, not just across the client base, but within the delivery teams has got a lot of traction of being a good tool for us to use.
So it's very important to get that full stakeholder buy-in, obviously, across the team, which makes sense. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to turn on to some lessons learned for the construction industry, but I just wanted to remind our audience to submit questions. We've had a number of really interesting questions already, so please do go ahead and submit your questions in the chat box provided. Thank you. So in terms of these lessons learned, what do you think, Steve, are the transferable lessons that have been learned during the process of collaboration and data sharing, which we've discussed in a bit of detail now?
Yeah, one of those outcomes of collaboration has been quite interesting during the COVID pandemic, and again going back to that standardization side of it and modularization. Off-site fabrication is something that is derived also from benchmarking, and lessons learned perhaps in other industries such as oil and gas, where modularization and off-site fabrication is quite normal. It's the de facto way of actually design and building. We've got an example that within GSK that we had to utilize those principles for a new build. So rather than a traditional stick build at a facility, that a modularization approach was taken. And obviously during the COVID pandemic, when existing facilities have to continue making other medicines, not just for COVID patients, but for a whole range of other patients, that it's critical that those supplies continue. And that in itself means that access to some of those facilities during the pandemic is actually very rigorously controlled, and discourages or even prevents people coming to the site who are not actually involved directly in the manufacturing process. So we found that on one of the projects where we were having the off-site building and fabrication, is that was able to carry on during the COVID pandemic. If it had been a traditional stick build at one of the facilities, then that would have probably not occurred, or it been extended considerably. So that's another aspect of benchmarking, is looking at how you can use that for modularization as well. But that was a real live example of what we have experienced over the past 18 months.
That's really interesting, Steve. Thank you. Do you have any comments on this point about transferable lessons into construction in terms of collaboration and data sharing, Nigel?
Yeah, I think it's the collective across the industries trying to look at the areas of alignment. So what I talked earlier about breaking the project down into its component parts, and actually looking at the sections of those projects, so that which are comparable across projects, and it's almost the 80-20 rule that 80% of data is transferable and therefore becomes useful. And I think it's that piece of making sure that the projects, when you look at it on it in totality, they're dissimilar, but when you look at it in the component parts, we can do that. And that's, I think, the collaboration has allowed people to do that by sharing, as we said earlier.
And just picking up this point, just picking up this point about the process of collaboration, if you like. I mean, one of the issues in construction is that we've got fairly siloed working in terms of professional training and education for surveyors, architects, engineers, and in fact for some contracting management as well. So I just wondered what you thought about this process of collaboration, how it can be improved in terms of perhaps using the term interdisciplinary working. Do you think the industry should concentrate a bit more on those issues? What are your general thoughts on that, perhaps, Nigel?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the pandemic is because there's a common understanding of what we've been trying to achieve on either developing the vaccines or building the facility to make the vaccines. Everybody involved knows what the common goal is to the moral aspects, as well as not just for all of us, for all our family, friends around us. So it's focused everybody to be aligned in their thinking to deliver the facilities, and it's shown to us what can happen with that alignment and the sharing of data and the use of all the resources to help align and move things along quicker. And lo and behold, moving along a lot of things along quicker, they're moving along at lower cost, and we're able to deliver more between us collectively. So that common goal has really helped focus, and that's been one of the lessons that I think we've all seen through the past few months of working together towards getting the vaccines to market as quick as we can.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I think also we look at it from a collaboration perspective and looking at those silos, is that the encouragement of interdiscipline communications and effectively through meetings about the normal everyday difficulties that you come across with regards to construction, but actually from a collaborative perspective is looking at solutions. So different functional contractors can certainly come up, we encourage them to come up with their own ideas and thoughts about how we could overcome problems as well. Just because it's a mechanical issue doesn't mean that the team of mechanical, electrical and civils just stay silent and just leave that to the mechanical contractor to try and resolve it. So we look at it from an integrated project delivery perspective as well, with regard to that collaboration. But it's a step forward, and it's about building that trust that goes with collaboration as well, and the right, and creating the right environment that your ideas are well thought of, that they're considered properly, and help us then to move forward. I think most, there's a lot of maturity in the industries, in the construction industries, and a lot of experience, and it's well worth tapping into those experiences and that knowledge to help that collaboration to take place, even at the construction site level as well.
Absolutely, Steve. Yeah, no, great point. And actually, on this issue of data sharing, also, I just wondered if GSK in these endeavours had thought about data as perhaps a more valuable commodity in terms of procurement, and we're wondering whether through procurement that they could insist on data in certain standardized forms and etc. Seeing data more as a commodity to value. Are GSK looking at that in any way, Steve?
I think in the wider sense, we're bringing together the information across a global network and globally situated projects, so that we do get the wider picture. I think it's going back to exactly the same principles of your identified, Alan, in silos. Okay, so again, between, let's say, for example, Europe and the States, we may be using the same suppliers, a global supply organization, but if there's a siloed country procurement team, then that sort of builds barriers into it. So we're actually sort of creating category managers with regards to procurement, so we can look across particular areas and specialised deliveries, irrespective of the location of that particular procurement specialist as well. So that's another aspect to it as well. It's building that knowledge. So as you say, fragmented information really isn't much use to you. But if you can start pulling together and getting the number of reference sites, it's like how we started off talking about having enough data to give us a good data set and a quality data set. And if you can apply that equally to procurement activities, then yes, that's where definitely we're implementing that sort of approach now.
Interesting. Thank you, Nigel. So, thank you, Stephen. Nigel, I just wondered what aspects of the manufacturing process do you feel are best suited to a data sharing and benchmarking approach, which we've talked about extensively, but I just welcome your thoughts on that point, Nigel. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious areas which touched on before. It's relatively easy to look at shell and core, for example, and clean rooms, and maybe process utilities, and you start on those. So the shell and core we can do very accurate benchmarking on, but it's actually a relatively small percentage of the overall cost. So we need to then start, as I said, look at the clean rooms and the process utilities. You can look at all of the process and manufacturing equipment. It tends to come from fairly similar manufacturers for the global supply. So again, it's sharing that data and working with those suppliers on their lead times and their costs and their current market. And also, if there's lots of projects done in certain sectors, so over the past 3 to 5 years, there's been a lot of biomanufacturing facilities built. So there's a lot of data about those. And currently, there's a switch towards cell gene therapy facilities. So there's less data in those on the overall scale, but we can pick up some of the data if you break it down, as I've said earlier. But then it's using the knowledge of that, all of that equipment and everything to say, well, actually, if it's new technology, we need to make an allowance for that. So again, it's not just looking at the cost per square meter, it's looking at it in all the various components. And also, as Steve said, starting to look at the different build types as well. So using the data to look at, do we want to do on-site building, off-site building? Are we going to use modern methods of construction? And we can start to look and use the data to get the balance to give us cost and schedule data to support the best procurement route that suits the right outcome. So if it's absolutely schedule driven, but it might be a higher cost, we can make that with an informed decision. And we're starting to look, and some of the benchmarks, and we haven't got much data yet, but it's starting to come in to look at other drivers as well. So we talked a lot about cost and schedule, but we shouldn't forget that we need to start looking at sustainability, decarbonisation of the facilities as well. So we're starting to collect data on that. So again, those will be, as we finish more projects, by looking at that data, we'll be able to start using that benchmarking data to help us make the better decisions. So it starts to link back to the different aspects of the manufacturing processes to help drive. So maybe looking at operating costs as well as construction costs, as well as the impact of the construction through the sustainability elements.
Yeah, and we've not really talked about, or the discussion so far have been under the presumably the assumption that when we have benchmarked or we want to benchmark a current facility against a previously benchmarked projects, that is okay, that is what you expect. But there will be occasions when the benchmarking shows that your current project, which you're looking perhaps to get the full funding from, doesn't benchmark as you had anticipated through the benchmarking data from institutes and organisations like Linesight. And again, that's then giving you an opportunity, some insight and probably some foresight then to think about why there is a variance in the benchmarking of your current or proposed facility, and then try to go back and understand why there is a difference, and is that acceptable or not. So that's part of the benchmarking process as well. It's not always going to give you exactly what you think the answer is. And if not, you've got an opportunity then to do something about it. And actually, if you look at the bigger loop with regard to once the benchmarking data sets are quite large, you then start getting a confidence and hopefully a surety of delivery. And you can start bringing this information back to the early stages when an idea is not a project yet. And if those ideas have a commercial basis, and you have to create an early stage estimate of what that facility might look like in the future. If you can utilize your benchmarking data from successful or completed projects and use those key factors, those metrics that you may have identified previously, that can help you at the even earlier stages. And as we know, the influence on projects is always at the earlier stage. The further down the delivery chain process that you go, the less influence you have in ensuring that your project will be successful. So again, it's sort of closing the loop on that.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. Often encapsulated in the mantra cost to design, don't design to a cost rather than cost to design.
Yeah.
But I mean, you're right to raise some of the challenges to benchmarking, because it's sometimes criticised for a lack of fairness in peer-to-peer comparison. And I know it's difficult to find two organisations or two projects that are exactly alike. And therefore, you know, what you've said today is very interesting in terms of ameliorating some of those issues. And it's been a fascinating discussion. But I'm going to turn now to some of the questions we've received, if I can put them to you, Steve and Nigel. And just looking down the questions that we've got one here from Priya Shah, and we touched on this, but it's an interesting question, really, in terms of how much data was available and how much of it was useful. We've talked about normalizing data, but was that quite a task? Nigel, perhaps turn to you first on that one.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, it's one of the things that's increasing more and more as industry evolves. There's more and more data. So yeah, we've got to be careful that on that's selective of the right data. So to answer the question, yes, there's enough data and there's enough partners willing to share data, because they know what the outcomes can be from that. But there is an element of making sure that the data is correct. So there is some projects we've looked at, and we just said that data, the quality of it, there's something not quite right. So obviously either working with the guys that generated it originally or not using it. So it has to be managed correctly. Otherwise you get some outliers. That there might be a valid reason for that, or it might just be poor data. So we tend to look around the core data around giving similar themes, but
yeah,
the outliers, but trying to understand the outliers. Sorry, Steve.
Yeah, and it goes back to one source of truth, one source of data as well, isn't it? And that's the other thing that sort of pops in my mind with this as well, is that as you go down this journey, then the quality of data and how the projects may be influenced by some external drivers or even internal drivers can manifest itself in some of the outturn costs of a project. So you have to work in an environment of openness and trust in the first place in getting that data in good shape, or be confident that it is good data.
Absolutely, yes. No, those are interesting points as well, and we can perhaps any questions that we can't answer, by the way, we will wrap up in terms of a document that we produce based upon the questions submitted. But I've got another one here from Roland, perhaps for you, Steve, because it concerns the big pharma industry particularly, and it says the various companies producing vaccines claim different levels of inverted commas effectiveness, and the cost per dose varies significantly. Would the construction industry accept a completion rate of up to 90%, or conversely, would that represent a significant improvement for our industry? So I suppose what he's asking there is, would the construction industry, and perhaps this is Nigel as well, accept a completion rate of up to 90%, you know, in terms of the efficacy of a vaccine? I suppose we're dealing with more complex environments in that sense, but
Yeah.
from the detail you've talked about today, I'm sure it's not that simple.
No, it's not. And again, I'm not a scientist, so I could probably just give a limited view. But yeah, I think in these particular circumstances where it's not, in some ways, you know, the COVID vaccination is not a unique, you know, particular organisation's uniqueness. So you probably wouldn't come across that before, but I would imagine that there are plenty of other measures similar to COVID, like paracetamol, for example, in terms of different manufacturers of paracetamol as well. So I think that, yeah, there was obviously a target for efficacy, and you know, and that was deemed as sort of the success of it. How that would vary from organisation to organisation would probably go down to their process and which is then their unique processes and how that product is actually being developed. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I suppose with COVID, you were probably looking for the highest possible, weren't you? I think that's probably what you would say on it.
Yeah, and I think from our point of view as I suppose the deliverers of the facilities that are making the vaccines, we talk about biosimilars. So making sure that every facility is making it to the highest standard, so we get as close to that, or we get to that 90% in every case. So quality of construction, quality of manufacturing is absolutely key, and I think that's collective role in this to make sure that anything that we're constructing, building, leading from a project point of view is quality, so that we allow the as possible of the vaccines.
Yes, and sometimes big decisions depend on turning the oil tanker in the right direction, don't they? So I think it was Steve was talking about some of the big decisions are made early on in the project when in fact we don't have precisely accurate information, but it still affects the outcome of the project. So I'm thinking about decarbonisation in particular, where the data on carbon, embodied carbon, is fairly scant. But if you can reduce it to some degree, then we're doing the right thing for the industry, and benchmarking can obviously help that. So that's perhaps analogous to that broad-based figure. But there's another very interesting question here from Tankizo Fike, which is about labour productivity, and he's asking, how would you deal with the issue of labour productivity in benchmarking? And I presume he's alluding to differences between regions and markets there. Nigel?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the benchmark is an ideal tool to allow us to do that, because we can look at with the data that we've got, we can look at those comparators in different regions. It comes back to a point I made earlier, and looking at data from the different regions. So if we're doing, and that does rely on a little bit of us doing similar types of, so we can look at the percentage, but not just, you've got to be careful. You're not just looking at cost, because it might be a lower cost rate in different markets. So you've got to look at the hours used for meterage of pipe installation, for example. This is as an example. So we can start to look, and then you can start are all projects in that region, do they take that certain number of hours per meter of pipe? So that is the benchmark standard for that region, compared to other regions which are different. So this is the sort of level of detail that we can get to within the benchmarking when we're looking across a big data set from around the world, from a number of companies, and you can start to see, and some of that could help those local regions say, you do realize your labor productivity is less, but that might be it's a norm for that area. So it's that data that allows us, probably as Steve said earlier, to look and analyze that actually sometimes things are different areas, different regions, different drivers, and the benchmark data allows us to say, well, that's what it is, and we can't compare it back to some central data, because we're working in different regions. So that's how we would look at doing it.
Okay, Nigel, thank you very much. Yeah. I've got a question here from Mohammed Rizwan. Setting a common strategy is a big hurdle while collaborating, and how did you overcome this? And I think he's obviously talking about how you align in the interests of everybody together in terms of a collaborative model, which is certainly always a challenge in construction. So I'm sure I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Perhaps Steve first.
Yeah, I think sort of answer the question with regard to the function of the institutes, of the facilitating organisations. That it's at that point really where the strategies I would perceive actually being put in place or developed, which would suit many different organisations. And yeah, I think it's that stepping forward in that trusting environment, and having that faith in everybody there, and knowing that I look at it and say that the data that we provide from our projects is of it's of limited scientific basis. Let's put it that way. It's so I don't ever see it being an issue with regards to providing some time and cost information and data associated with projects. It's sort of it's that way around. It's with the projects, not the projects actually driving the what's the detail of the project and what that means. Yeah, I'm not sure how much more. Not sure how to answer that in terms of the strategy.
I think maybe Steve come in and say what we looked at was what are we hearing are the common issues across the different client organizations, and the two that came out mostly were at an early stage when we're looking at business decisions, how much might it cost? So we haven't done any design yet, we're just trying to get a number to put in our budget for next year and our capital budget. And also when it goes forward for approval to the Chief Financial Officer, who's saying, okay, that and I'll pick a number at 250 million looks like a reasonable number, but how does that compare to what all my peers are paying? And what we found were all companies were asking the answers to those two questions. So that provided the commonality to say, well, actually, by doing this together, we can help you answer those questions within your own organization. So it was finding the common questions that were being asked and required answers across all of the different collaborative companies.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you both. Well, we're coming to the close now, and I need to thank Nigel and Steve for a really fantastic, insightful session, and a particular thank you to Linesight for sponsoring this event. I want to just remind you all that we will publish a recording and written summary of this webinar online, and please feel free to share that with those in your professional networks. Please also take a few moments to let us know what you thought of today's session by completing the online poll, which will appear on your screens at the end of the webinar. And I'd also like to remind you that the World Built Environment Forum Global Summit will be visiting Dubai as part of Expo 2020 Dubai in January 2022, and the program will focus on the livable city, stable, smart and healthy. To register your interest and to find further details on the program, please visit the website rics.org/WBEF. And don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn, where you can receive news of upcoming webinars and catch up on any you may have missed. And finally, please also take a look at our podcast series, have a listen and tell us what you think. And in conclusion, you can download the WBEF from the App Store or Google Play, where you can access the latest innovative global thought leadership content across the whole of the built environment. So until next time, goodbye and stay well. Thank you.